Okay, let's just try to unpack what we've seen lately. I mean, you have Putin showing up in Alaska, then you've got Zelensky with this huge European delegation right there in the White House with Trump. It's been a total whirlwind of high-stakes diplomacy over the war in Ukraine. But the real question is, are we actually any closer to peace?
And that quote from historian Sergei Radchenko really just hits the nail on the head. You see all the photo ops, you hear the big statements, a lot of fireworks. But when you look at what's actually changed, almost nothing. So what is really going on here?
This all happened so fast. It was this sudden flurry of meetings, and it really felt like European leaders were scrambling to manage President Trump after he had his own meeting with Vladimir Putin.
And that gets us to the absolute core of what we're digging into in this explainer. Is this a real, genuine push to end this brutal war? Or is this something else? A big diplomatic show that could have some really dangerous consequences for everybody.
To even begin to understand what's happening, you first have to look at what each of the key players actually wants. Because, as you're about to see, their goals are not just different, they're pretty much in direct conflict.
So here's the thing. Everybody at the table has a totally different agenda. For Donald Trump, it's all about getting that historic deal, being the peacemaker. For Zelensky, it's about pure survival. He needs U.S. support, but he can't get forced into a terrible deal. Putin, he wants to lock in his territorial gains and basically control Ukraine's destiny. And the Europeans, honestly, they're just trying to keep Trump on a leash so he doesn't make a bad deal that hands Putin a huge win. And this right here shows you the problem perfectly. President Trump wants a deal so badly that his position seems to change depending on who he just talked to. I mean, think about it. Before he met with Putin, the big demand was a ceasefire. But right after that meeting, suddenly the ceasefire talk vanished, and Trump started using Putin's language about a full peace plan. It's incredibly unpredictable.
All right, let's talk about the first giant roadblock, because this is where things get really tough. It's the most basic disagreement of all. What happens to all the Ukrainian land that Russia is currently occupying?
And just as a quick reminder of how we even got to this point, the whole thing started way back in 2014 with Crimea and the war in the Donbass. Then came the full-scale invasion in 2022, and after a Ukrainian counteroffensive stalled out, Russia now controls a huge chunk of Ukraine's east and south.
Now, here's what's wild about Putin's demands. It's not just we keep the land we have. No, he's demanding that Ukraine completely pull its troops out of the entire Donbass region. And that includes handing over these incredibly fortified cities, places Russia hasn't even been able to capture on the battlefield.
So you can imagine the position this puts Ukrainian President Zelensky in. It's just an absolutely impossible choice. He's basically caught between a rock and a hard place, with either option leading to a potential political disaster for him and for Ukraine. I mean, just look at this. On one hand, if he says no to a deal that Trump is pushing, he risks losing that vital American support, which would be catastrophic for the war effort. But if he says yes and agrees to sign away huge parts of his country, he'll have to face the absolute fury of his own people, who have sacrificed everything to defend that very land. It's a lose-lose situation.
And this quote from Radchenko really gets to the heart of it. The fear is that the Trump administration might be missing the real endgame here. For Putin, this isn't just about grabbing land. The ultimate goal is to make Ukraine a vassal state, a country that's independent in name only, but is really under Moscow's thumb.
So if the whole land issue is basically an unsolvable puzzle piece, the second piece is just as messy, and that's this whole abstract idea of security guarantees. Basically, a promise that other countries will protect Ukraine down the road. So what do we mean when we say security guarantee? Well, it's a formal promise that if you get attacked, other countries will come and defend you. The best example, the gold standard, is NATO's Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's what a real hard guarantee looks like. So the big question is, what kind of guarantee is Ukraine actually being offered? And this is where the whole thing just kind of falls apart, because it seems like nobody can agree on what's being promised or what Russia would ever accept. And you can see the enormous gap right here. The U.S. is talking about maybe coordinating European guarantees, and Trump has been very clear, no American troops. Meanwhile, Russia says, sure, Western guarantees are fine, as long as we have a veto, which of course means Russia could just block any attempt to actually use the guarantee, making the whole thing completely worthless. And look, the European countries are saying they might be willing to offer those hard guarantees, maybe even sending their own troops. But, and this is a huge but, they'll only do it if the U.S. military provides a backstop, a promise to jump in if things go south. And that is the one thing President Trump has said no to.
So after all the whirlwind meetings, after all the big talk, we're left staring at what really does look like an unsolvable puzzle. And it's a puzzle that's built on a foundation of just deep, deep mistrust.
Let's just be brutally honest about where we are right now. The war is still going. There is no ceasefire. There isn't even a real concrete peace plan that anyone can agree on. They're talking about maybe having a big summit with Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, but it would be a meeting with literally no foundation, nothing agreed on beforehand.
And at the absolute center of all of this is trust, or a complete lack of it. As the French president Emmanuel Macron has basically said, Vladimir Putin has a very long track record of not keeping his promises and of just being a destabilizing force. How do you build a lasting peace on that?
This is what keeps analysts up at night. The biggest risk of all is that in this big rush to get a deal, any deal, they sign some vague agreement that's impossible to enforce. It wouldn't end the conflict. It would just start a new one, a frozen conflict with years of arguments over who's breaking the rules. And yet, even people who are critical of this whole process still admit, you have to try. The approach might feel chaotic, the problems might seem impossible to solve, but it leaves us all with this one final question. In a war this devastating, is it always better to keep talking, even if those talks seem doomed from the start?